Human rescues alien girl from falling skiff, revealing a bond neither understands. Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, back to our main character. Ethan Davis had never been one to shy away from a challenge. Standing tall at 6 feet 2 inches, with a sharp jawline that had been hardened by years of military service, he looked every bit the part of a seasoned veteran. His uniform, a standard-issue combat suit, clung to his broad shoulders and chest, its fabric stained with the dust of countless worlds. The setting was harsh, on a desolate desert planet. The winds howled like a predatory beast. The sky above was an endless expanse of grey clouds, blocking out the sun, casting everything in a dull, lifeless light. Ethan's mission had been straightforward: assist with the transport of supplies from one base to another. But as the skiff he piloted sliced through the air, something went wrong. A sudden jolt, followed by the unmistakable sound of metal groaning under pressure, made his heart race. He quickly glanced at the malfunctioning control panel, his fingers dancing across the buttons to stabilize the craft. But no matter what he tried, the skiff was coming down. Fast. Below, the barren landscape stretched endlessly, a perfect place for a crash landing. However, it wasn't the crash he was concerned with, it was the lone figure he saw drifting in the distance. A girl. Her figure was small, fragile even, barely visible against the swirling sandstorm that was kicking up. As the skiff began to descend uncontrollably, Ethan's instincts took over. With a swift motion, he activated the emergency thrusters, trying desperately to correct the skiff's trajectory. His heart pounded in his chest as the ground rushed closer, but the image of the girl, the alien girl, loomed larger in his mind. He couldn't let her fall, not when she was so vulnerable. At the last possible second, he managed to steady the skiff, the undercarriage scraping along the rough terrain as he brought it to a halt. He quickly unstrapped himself and bolted from the cockpit, rushing toward where he had last seen her. The wind was biting and cold, making it harder to see, but through the storm, he caught sight of her, her delicate, ethereal form, standing still, seemingly unaware of the danger. Her eyes were wide, her blue skin glowing faintly under the grey sky. Ethan didn't hesitate. He moved toward her, his voice cutting through the howling wind. "Hey! Are you all right?" His voice was rough, urgent, but there was a soft undertone of concern that he couldn't quite hide. The girl turned, her bright violet eyes locking onto his. For a moment, neither of them moved, as if the world itself had stopped. And then, as if snapping out of a trance, she spoke in a language Ethan didn't understand, her voice melodic but laced with confusion. She wasn't speaking standard, the universal language of the galaxy. Ethan paused, trying to piece together what was happening. Her body was shaking, not from the cold, but from something deeper, a fear he hadn't expected. She took a step back, her hands raised defensively. But then, something unexpected happened. Ethan reached out, his hand steady, and gently touched her arm. The contact was electric, something passed between them in that brief moment, something neither of them could explain. Her guard dropped slightly, and her expression softened, though her confusion remained. Ethan smiled, though it was tinged with uncertainty. He didn't know what had just happened between them, but he could feel the pull, the connection. As he helped her to her feet, he realized that in the chaos of the crash, something more had begun to form between them. Something neither of them fully understood yet. And just like that, the bond had been formed. The bond that would change both their lives forever. As Ethan steadied Lyra, he felt her tremble slightly beneath his touch, a quiet ripple of energy running through him. He couldn't shake the feeling that this moment, this simple act of saving her from falling, had somehow connected them in a way he couldn't explain. As he helped her to her feet, her violet eyes met his, a silent understanding passing between them. She didn't speak at first, but her gaze was softer now, no longer filled with the fear that had initially clouded her expression. Ethan studied her, trying to understand what she was feeling, but he couldn't be sure. She was different from the others he had encountered in his time as a soldier. There was something about her, something that made him feel like she wasn't just another alien from a distant world. Lyra took a cautious step back, her long, silver hair drifting in the wind, as if it had a life of its own. She looked around, her body tense, and Ethan could tell she was still processing everything. "Are you all right?" Ethan asked again, his voice softer this time, as if he could ease the storm in her mind with just a few words. She nodded slowly, still not speaking, but there was a slight shift in her posture that suggested she was beginning to trust him, even if only a little. Ethan took a step forward, instinctively reaching for her hand. To his surprise, she didn't pull away. Instead, she placed her hand in his, the warmth of her touch sending a jolt of electricity through him. It was as if the world around them faded away, leaving only the two of them standing together in the howling wind, the connection between them growing stronger with each passing second. But as quickly as the moment had arrived, it was gone. Lyra withdrew her hand, her eyes flickering with uncertainty. "I don't understand," she whispered, her voice almost lost in the wind. Ethan felt a pang of sympathy. He didn't understand either. But he knew one thing for sure: something had shifted between them, something that neither of them could explain. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could say anything, a low rumble echoed in the distance. Lyra tensed, her gaze darting toward the horizon. Ethan followed her eyes, his heart racing as the ground beneath them began to shake. He had seen enough to know that this wasn't just a tremor, it was something bigger, something dangerous. "We need to move," Ethan said, his voice firm with urgency. Without waiting for a response, he grabbed Lyra's arm gently, guiding her toward the nearby shelter. Lyra hesitated for a moment, her body still tense with uncertainty, but then she nodded, following his lead. As they moved through the barren landscape, the ground shook again, this time harder, sending dust and debris swirling around them. Ethan's mind raced as he tried to make sense of the situation. Whatever was happening, it wasn't natural. And it seemed to be getting worse by the minute. Lyra's grip on his arm tightened as the tremors grew stronger, her steps quicker, more desperate. Ethan's heart went out to her. She was scared, but there was nothing he could do to ease that fear, at least not yet. All he could do was protect her, keep her safe until they could figure out what was going on. They reached the shelter just as the ground trembled once more, this time with a force that nearly knocked them off their feet. The door to the shelter slammed shut behind them with a loud bang, sealing them inside. Ethan took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. But his thoughts kept drifting back to Lyra. She was unlike any other alien he had ever met. There was something in her eyes, something that made him feel like he had to protect her, like his entire mission had led to this moment. Lyra stood in the center of the room, her eyes wide and scanning the space, her body still tense. Ethan watched her carefully, unsure of what to say. They were safe for now, but the storm outside was far from over. And neither of them knew what was coming next. The shelter was dimly lit, the faint glow of emergency lights casting long shadows across the room. Ethan stood near the door, keeping a watchful eye on Lyra as she paced back and forth, her movements fluid, yet filled with a restless energy. The tremors outside had subsided, but the silence in the air was deafening. Ethan knew they couldn't stay here forever. The planet had already shown its unpredictability, and he didn't trust it to stay calm for long. Lyra's steps faltered for a moment as she glanced at him. Her violet eyes met his, a silent question hanging in the air between them. "Do you think it's safe?" she asked, her voice quiet but laced with a hint of worry. Ethan shrugged, though the uncertainty gnawed at him. "Hard to say. The tremors are unusual. But we can't just sit here waiting to find out what happens next." Lyra nodded, her expression softening. She had been quiet since the crash, and Ethan could tell that she was processing a lot more than he could see. He wanted to offer reassurance. But the truth was, he didn't know what would happen next either. They were alone on an alien world, and all he could do was protect her as best as he could. The silence stretched on, broken only by the hum of the shelter's systems. Ethan's mind raced as he thought about their next move. They needed to get off this planet, find out what had caused the tremors, and figure out how to survive. "I think we need to find a way off this planet," Ethan said, breaking the silence. "There's a supply base about 10 miles from here. It's a long shot, but it might have what we need to get a ship up and running." Lyra paused, considering his words. She had no reason to trust him, and yet, she seemed to understand the urgency in his tone. Her gaze softened, and for a moment, Ethan saw something in her eyes that made him feel like they were on the same page. "I'll go with you," she said finally, her voice steady. "But I don't know what I'm walking into. This planet, it's not like anything I've ever known." Ethan gave a small nod, a sense of gratitude flooding through him. "We'll figure it out together. We don't have much choice." As they prepared to leave the shelter, the air outside felt colder than before, the wind biting at their skin as they stepped into the open. Ethan kept his rifle close, scanning the horizon for any signs of danger. Lyra walked beside him, her movements purposeful but careful. They didn't speak as they made their way through the desolate landscape, the only sound the crunch of their boots against the cracked ground. As they traveled, Ethan's thoughts drifted back to the moment they shared in the shelter. The bond between them had grown in a way that neither of them could explain, and though he was used to fighting for survival, this was different. He wasn't just protecting a mission or a stranger anymore. He was protecting something more, something intangible that was slowly taking root in his chest. They walked for what felt like hours, the landscape unchanged, when suddenly, a low rumble echoed in the distance. Lyra stopped in her tracks, her eyes scanning the sky, a look of recognition flickering across her face. "It's coming," she whispered, her voice filled with dread. Ethan's heart skipped a beat as he turned toward her. "What's coming?" Lyra's gaze shifted to the horizon. "The storm. We don't have much time." The wind picked up suddenly, the temperature dropping rapidly as dark clouds gathered overhead. Ethan's instincts kicked in. They needed to find cover, fast. Without a word, he grabbed Lyra's arm and pulled her toward a nearby ridge, hoping they could outrun the storm. As they ran, the ground beneath them trembled once again, stronger this time, and the air grew thick with an ominous energy. They reached the ridge just as the storm hit, the first wave of sand and debris rushing toward them. Ethan pulled Lyra close, using his body to shield her from the worst of it. The storm raged around them, the world spinning into chaos. But amidst the chaos, Ethan realized something: no matter how fierce the storm was, no matter how impossible the odds, he couldn't let go of the bond that had formed between them. He would keep her safe, even if it meant facing the storm head-on. The storm howled around them, a relentless force that seemed to swallow everything in its path. Ethan and Lyra huddled against the jagged ridge, seeking shelter from the stinging sand and freezing wind. The storm was like nothing Ethan had ever experienced. The intensity of the gusts made it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead, and the temperature dropped rapidly, leaving a biting chill that cut through even the thickest of clothing. Ethan glanced at Lyra, her pale blue skin now tinged with a deeper hue, her silver hair whipping around her face as she struggled to keep her footing. She had never been in a storm like this either, and he could tell the cold was getting to her. Without a word, he pulled her closer, wrapping his arm around her to shield her from the worst of the wind. "We need to find cover," Ethan shouted over the roar of the storm, his voice barely audible. Lyra nodded, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and determination. She didn't know where they could go, but she trusted him. They had no other choice but to move forward. Ethan's military training kicked in as he scanned the horizon. There had to be something, some kind of structure or shelter. In the distance, just barely visible through the swirling sand, he saw the faint outline of what appeared to be an old, abandoned building. It wasn't much, but it was their only chance. "Over there," Ethan shouted, pointing toward the structure. Lyra followed his gaze, and without hesitation, they set off, moving quickly despite the storm's efforts to slow them down. The sand stung their skin like 1,000 tiny needles, and the wind threatened to push them off course, but Ethan kept his focus on the building ahead. As they neared it, the storm seemed to intensify, the air becoming thick with dust and debris. Ethan could barely make out the shape of the building now, but he pushed on, each step more difficult than the last. They reached the entrance and Ethan shoved the door open with all his strength, finally pulling Lyra inside. The building was dark and musty, the air thick with the scent of old wood and decay. Ethan took a moment to catch his breath, his heart pounding in his chest. They were safe, for now. Lyra leaned against the wall, her chest rising and falling rapidly as she tried to recover from the storm's toll. Ethan watched her, his eyes softening. He had to admit, he was worried about her. She was unlike any alien he had ever encountered. Her strength, her intelligence, it all fascinated him, but there was something else, something deeper that pulled him toward her. Lyra turned to face him, her violet eyes meeting his with a quiet intensity. "Thank you," she said, her voice hoarse but sincere. Ethan gave her a small nod, not trusting his voice. "We're not out of the woods yet," he said quietly, his eyes scanning the dark interior of the building. They needed to rest, but they couldn't afford to stay here too long. The storm outside was still raging, and the longer they waited, the more dangerous it became. Lyra nodded, understanding the unspoken message. They needed to keep moving, to find a way off this planet. She didn't know how long it would take or what they would have to face, but she knew one thing for sure: they would face it together. Ethan glanced at her, a small, determined smile crossing his face. "Let's get some rest. Tomorrow, we head out again." Lyra didn't reply immediately, but her eyes softened as she looked at him. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time since the crash, she felt a flicker of hope. Whatever was coming, she knew she wouldn't face it alone. And that thought, that simple connection, was enough to make her believe they could survive this planet, and whatever else lay ahead. The next morning, the storm outside had finally subsided, leaving a thick layer of dust in the air and a stillness that seemed unnatural. Ethan and Lyra emerged from the shelter, squinting against the harsh sunlight that had returned to the sky. The landscape around them was eerily quiet, the wind now only a whisper compared to the fury it had unleashed the day before. Ethan adjusted his pack and glanced at Lyra, who was standing silently beside him, her gaze lost in the distance. He couldn't help but notice how much stronger she seemed now, her posture straighter, her steps more assured. She had taken the events of the previous day in stride, but he knew that beneath her calm exterior, there was a storm of her own, one that she was still trying to understand. They began walking again, the path ahead winding through the rocky terrain that seemed to stretch endlessly. Ethan kept his pace steady, making sure to stay within earshot of Lyra in case she needed anything. Her silence, however, felt more like a calm before a storm, and he could tell that she was lost in thought. He didn't push her to speak, but after a while, the quiet grew too heavy for him. "What do you think is out there?" Ethan asked, his voice breaking the silence. Lyra's eyes shifted toward him, her violet gaze catching his. She seemed to consider the question for a moment before responding. "I don't know," she said softly, her voice laced with uncertainty. "I've never been to this part of the planet before. It's unfamiliar." Ethan nodded, understanding the feeling all too well. There were many things he didn't know about this planet either, and that uncertainty weighed on him. "We'll find answers," he said, more to reassure himself than her. "Together." Lyra didn't reply immediately, but the soft nod she gave him spoke volumes. They continued walking, the terrain gradually becoming more rugged as they climbed a steep hill that led to a narrow pass between two jagged cliffs. The air was thin, and the climb was exhausting, but Ethan didn't mind. It gave him time to think, to plan, and to reflect on how much had changed in such a short time. Lyra was no longer just an alien he had rescued. She had become someone he felt a deep responsibility for, someone he couldn't walk away from. As they reached the top of the hill, the view opened up before them, revealing a vast stretch of land below. Ethan's eyes scanned the horizon, looking for any sign of the supply base he had mentioned, but the landscape was barren, save for a few scattered rocks and dry riverbeds. He felt a pang of doubt in his chest. Was this even the right direction? But before he could voice his concerns, Lyra spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "What happens if we don't make it?" Ethan turned to face her, her words hanging in the air between them. She wasn't looking at him now, her gaze was fixed on the distant horizon. It was a question he had asked himself many times, but hearing it from her brought a weight to it that he hadn't anticipated. "We make it," he said firmly, more to convince himself than anything. Lyra finally looked at him, her eyes filled with an unreadable expression. "You're sure?" she asked. Ethan hesitated for a moment before responding. "I'm sure." There was a brief silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that came from mutual understanding, from the unspoken agreement that, no matter the outcome, they would face it together. They both knew the dangers ahead. They knew the odds were stacked against them. But in that moment, with the sun beating down on them and the wind finally calm, there was something else, a sense of quiet determination. Lyra nodded once, as if accepting his words, and together they began their descent from the hill. The journey was far from over, but for the first time since the crash, Ethan felt a sense of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep moving forward. The day stretched on as Ethan and Lyra made their way through the rocky terrain, the sun now high above them. Despite the long hours of walking, the landscape around them seemed to offer no relief. Every direction they looked was barren, save for the occasional outcrop of rock or the dry remnants of what might have once been a riverbed. The air was still thin, and the heat was beginning to bear down on them, making each step more exhausting than the last. Ethan kept his pace steady, glancing over at Lyra every so often. She was moving with quiet determination, but he could tell she was struggling too. Her breath was shallow, and she wiped the sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. Ethan wanted to say something, to offer some words of encouragement, but he knew that they both understood the gravity of the situation. They had no choice but to keep moving. As they continued forward, the faintest shimmer on the horizon caught Ethan's eye. His heart skipped a beat as he squinted against the glare of the sun. Could it be? Was it the supply base he had been hoping for? "Lyra, look over there," Ethan said, his voice tinged with hope. Lyra stopped in her tracks, her eyes following his gaze. For a moment, she said nothing, only watching the shimmer in the distance. Then, her voice came, soft but steady. "It could be. But we have to be sure." Ethan nodded, his pulse quickening. They both knew that there was still a long way to go, and even though the shimmering light on the horizon offered a glimmer of hope, there was no guarantee that it would be what they needed. Still, it was their best chance. "Let's go," Ethan said, pushing forward. They moved faster now, the thought of the supply base urging them on. As they neared the shimmer, the outline of what appeared to be a building came into view, its shape becoming clearer with every step. It was an old structure, partially collapsed in some places, but still standing strong enough to offer shelter. Ethan's hope grew with each step. This was it. They had made it. As they reached the entrance, Lyra stopped, her eye scanning the area. Ethan followed her gaze, his hand instinctively reaching for his rifle. The silence in the air was deafening, and the stillness around them felt unnerving. "Do you sense anything?" Ethan asked quietly. Lyra stood still for a moment, her eyes narrowing as she focused on the surroundings. Then, slowly, she nodded. "Something's off. I can feel it." Ethan's grip on his rifle tightened. He didn't know what Lyra sensed, but he trusted her instincts. Together, they stepped into the building, the door creaking as it opened. The inside was dark, the air heavy with dust and the smell of old machinery. Ethan's eyes adjusted to the low light as they moved deeper into the building. It wasn't what he had expected. The walls were lined with old technology, some of it unfamiliar to him, but much of it appeared to be long forgotten, abandoned in haste. Lyra's footsteps echoed softly as she moved past him, her hand brushing against the walls as she explored. "This place doesn't look like it's been used in years," Ethan muttered, surveying the surroundings. Lyra paused for a moment, her eye scanning the room. "It hasn't. But there's something here, something valuable." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "I'm not sure," Lyra said, her voice distant. "But I can feel it. This place isn't just a relic. It was once important." Ethan nodded slowly. He didn't have the luxury of time to figure out what Lyra meant, but he trusted her judgment. They needed to find what they came for and leave before whatever had been hidden here was uncovered. The air in the building felt heavy, and Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He glanced at Lyra, who had stopped in front of a large console. She was examining it with intense focus, her brow furrowed in concentration. "What is it?" Ethan asked, moving closer. Lyra turned to face him, her eyes wide with realization. "This is it. This is the technology I've been searching for." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. This could be their ticket off the planet. But before he could ask what she meant, a low rumble filled the air, and the ground beneath them trembled once again. The building shook, the walls groaning under the pressure. Lyra's eyes widened in alarm. "We need to get out of here. Now." Ethan didn't hesitate. He grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the exit, the sounds of the building's collapse growing louder behind them. They had no time to waste. As they made their way back to the entrance, the ground shook violently, and debris began to fall around them. Ethan pushed Lyra ahead of him, his mind racing. The building was coming down, and they needed to get to safety. They reached the entrance just as a massive crack split the floor beneath them, and Ethan's heart raced with the urgency of the situation. "Go," he shouted, pushing Lyra through the doorway. They made it outside just as the building crumbled behind them, sending a cloud of dust into the air. Ethan pulled Lyra to the ground, shielding her as the debris rained down around them. When the dust settled, he looked at her, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice tight with worry. Lyra nodded, her eyes wide but determined. "We made it," she said softly. "But we're not done yet." Ethan nodded. They weren't out of danger yet, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like they had a chance. And that was enough to keep going. The morning after the collapse of the building, Ethan and Lyra found themselves back in the wilderness, once again standing before an uncertain future. The air was cooler now, the morning light casting long shadows across the rocky landscape, but the sense of urgency hadn't dissipated. They had narrowly escaped the collapsing structure, but there was still no sign of the supply base Ethan had hoped to reach. The journey ahead felt even more daunting than before, but they had no choice but to continue. Lyra stood silently, her eyes scanning the horizon as if searching for something she couldn't quite see. Ethan, too, couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The landscape was too quiet, the kind of stillness that felt unnatural, like the calm before another storm. "We need to move," Ethan said, breaking the silence. He glanced at Lyra, who nodded without a word. Her silence wasn't uncomfortable, but it was heavy, filled with thoughts and emotions she wasn't ready to share. Ethan understood. He wasn't much for talking either, especially when the world around him seemed to be crumbling. He adjusted the strap of his pack and began walking, keeping a steady pace. Lyra followed, her footsteps light and quick, though she had yet to speak. As they made their way through the rocky terrain, Ethan's mind wandered. The events of the past few days weighed heavily on him. It felt like everything was changing too quickly, and he wasn't sure if he was ready for what came next. But with Lyra by his side, he knew he couldn't stop now. They had come too far to turn back. After several hours of walking, the rocky landscape began to give way to a more open area, and in the distance, Ethan spotted something that made his heart skip a beat, a small, hidden outpost tucked against the side of a mountain. It wasn't much, but it was their best hope yet. "There," Ethan said, pointing toward the outpost. Lyra squinted in the direction he indicated, her eyes narrowing as she took in the sight. She didn't speak, but the way she moved told Ethan that she had already made up her mind. They would go there, and they would figure out what to do next. As they approached the outpost, Ethan's heart beat faster. This was it, the place they had been searching for. It was small, but there was a sense of security in its walls, something that felt different from the wild, open expanse they had been navigating. As they got closer, Ethan noticed that the place seemed oddly deserted. No movement, no signs of life, just the quiet hum of an old generator in the distance. Ethan didn't like it. He motioned for Lyra to stay close, his hand on the grip of his rifle as he carefully approached the entrance. The door was partially open, a slight gap that invited them in but also warned of the unknown. "Stay alert," Ethan whispered, his voice low and steady. Lyra nodded, her eyes scanning their surroundings as they stepped inside. The interior was dark, lit only by the dim light filtering through broken windows. Dust covered the floors, and the smell of stale air and rust lingered in the air. It looked abandoned, but something didn't feel right. They moved cautiously through the building, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the empty halls. As they rounded a corner, Lyra stopped abruptly, her hand shooting out to stop Ethan. "Something's wrong," she said quietly, her voice tense. Ethan turned to look at her, his instincts kicking in. He could see it in her eyes, the same feeling he had. They were being watched. Without warning, a loud crash sounded from deep within the building, followed by the sound of footsteps approaching quickly. Ethan motioned for Lyra to stay back as he advanced, his weapon raised. The footsteps grew louder, closer. And then, just as quickly as it had started, everything went silent again. The tension in the air was thick, and Ethan's heart raced as he took another step forward, his eyes darting around, trying to locate the source of the noise. "Ethan," Lyra's voice was low, barely a whisper, but the fear in it was unmistakable. Ethan didn't answer, his attention focused entirely on the silence around them. They were not alone. He could feel it. He had to make a decision. Should they hide and wait, or move forward and confront whatever, or whoever, was out there? His hand tightened on the rifle. There was no turning back now. Ethan signaled for Lyra to follow him. As they made their way down the corridor, the sound of the footsteps started again, but this time, they were moving in the opposite direction, retreating further into the building. Ethan didn't hesitate. He and Lyra moved swiftly, making their way toward the noise, both aware that whatever waited for them was bound to change the course of their journey forever. The silence that followed the retreating footsteps was deafening. Ethan and Lyra stood motionless in the dim corridor, their breaths shallow, their senses on high alert. The building was too still, too quiet. Ethan could hear the faint hum of machinery in the background, but it did little to drown out the pounding in his chest. The earlier tension was thick in the air, and every step they took now felt like it echoed through the empty halls. The footsteps had stopped, but Ethan's instincts told him they weren't alone. He motioned for Lyra to stay close as they advanced cautiously down the corridor. The dim light flickered overhead, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and move with each step they took. They reached the corner where the noise had originated, but as they peered around it, there was nothing. Just more empty rooms and old, abandoned equipment. "Where did they go?" Lyra whispered, her voice barely audible. Ethan didn't respond immediately. He was scanning the area, his eyes flicking between the darkened doorways. "Stay sharp," he said quietly. They stepped further into the hall, their footsteps muffled on the old, worn floor. As they moved deeper into the building, a distant sound broke the silence again, a faint scraping noise, followed by a low, mechanical whirring. Ethan's hand instinctively went to the rifle slung over his shoulder. He knew the sound, it was coming from an old elevator shaft, a relic from the base's earlier days. "We're not alone," he muttered, more to himself than to Lyra. Lyra nodded in agreement, her posture tense, her hand hovering near her side as if ready for anything. They made their way toward the source of the noise, carefully avoiding the creaky floorboards that threatened to give them away. The elevator shaft loomed ahead, dark and foreboding. The whirring grew louder as they approached. It was unmistakable now. Someone, or something, was using the lift. Ethan motioned for Lyra to stay back. He needed to see what they were dealing with. He crouched low, creeping closer to the edge of the shaft. The lift's doors were half open, and through the narrow gap, Ethan could see a figure standing inside. It was hard to make out details in the dim light, but the silhouette looked humanoid. As Ethan's eyes adjusted, he saw the faint glow of violet skin. His heart skipped a beat. Could it be another alien? But before he could act, the figure inside the lift turned toward the gap in the door. Ethan froze, not daring to breathe. The figure paused, seemingly sensing his presence. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, the figure stepped back, disappearing into the shadows of the lift. Ethan's muscles tensed. This wasn't good. Whoever, or whatever, was in there, it was waiting for them. He turned to Lyra, his face set in a grim expression. "Stay behind me," he whispered. "And keep your eyes open." Lyra nodded, her face unreadable, but Ethan could see the wariness in her eyes. She was ready for whatever was coming. They approached the lift cautiously, but as they neared the door, it suddenly slammed shut, sending a shudder through the building. The mechanical whirring stopped, replaced by a deep, unsettling silence. Ethan's hand tightened around the rifle. "They're making us play their game now," he said, his voice low and steady. Lyra stepped closer to him, her eyes narrowing in determination. "Whatever it is, we're not backing down." Ethan nodded. Together, they moved forward, ready to face whatever waited for them in the darkness of the abandoned outpost. They had come this far, and they couldn't afford to turn back now. The building seemed to hold its breath as they advanced, every footstep a countdown to the unknown. With every passing moment, the tension mounted. But Ethan knew one thing for sure: whatever came next, they would face it together. And together, they had a better chance of surviving than they ever would alone. The door to the lift slammed shut, sealing them off from whatever lay inside. Ethan's heart raced as the silence that followed seemed to stretch on forever. He exchanged a quick glance with Lyra, her eyes narrowing in determination, matching his own. They had come so far, fought through so much together, and now they were faced with this. Ethan's instinct screamed that they weren't alone anymore. Someone, or something, was watching them. The tension in the air was thick, almost suffocating. Ethan placed a hand on the cold, rusted surface of the lift doors, feeling the faint vibrations beneath his fingertips. He could hear the faint hum of distant machinery, the groan of the old building settling around them. The outpost felt alive, but not in a comforting way. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. Without speaking, Ethan motioned for Lyra to follow him. They needed to move quickly before whatever had been in the lift found them. They turned down the corridor, stepping cautiously over debris and broken machinery. The light overhead flickered sporadically, casting strange, elongated shadows on the walls. Lyra stayed close, her eye scanning every corner, every darkened doorway. Ethan's grip on his rifle tightened as they moved deeper into the building. It felt like every step brought them closer to something they couldn't fully understand, but Ethan wasn't about to back down now. They had no other choice but to keep moving forward. As they passed another corner, they heard it, faint at first, but unmistakable. The sound of a footstep, slow and deliberate, echoing down the hall. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. They weren't alone. "Stay close," he whispered to Lyra, his voice barely audible. She nodded without a word, her body tense, ready to move at a moment's notice. They pressed forward, stepping quietly, trying to avoid making a sound. Ethan's mind raced as he tried to piece together what was happening. He had been in enough dangerous situations to know that this felt different. The building, the strange noises, the feeling of being watched, it all pointed to something more than just a simple abandoned outpost. They reached another doorway, and this time, Ethan didn't hesitate. He swung it open, his rifle raised, ready for anything. But there was nothing. The room was empty, save for a few scattered crates and pieces of old equipment. It was exactly the kind of place where something could hide in plain sight. Ethan motioned for Lyra to move in. As they crossed the threshold, the floor creaked beneath their feet, and Lyra's eyes immediately went to the far corner of the room. "Something's here," she said, her voice low, her eyes narrowing. Ethan followed her gaze and froze. In the far corner, partially obscured by shadows, stood an old console. It hummed with life, lights flickering across its surface, as if it had been recently activated. Ethan took a step toward it, his boots scraping against the floor. The moment he touched the console, the lights in the room flickered once more, and a low, mechanical voice echoed through the speakers. "Intruders detected." The voice was flat, emotionless. Ethan froze. This wasn't a simple abandoned base. Someone had been here, and they were expecting them. "We need to leave, now," Lyra said, her voice urgent. But it was too late. The door they had entered through slammed shut, locking them inside. The walls began to hum, a low vibration growing louder by the second. Ethan's mind raced as he assessed their options. They were trapped. They had no way out. The voice came again, this time louder, more insistent. "You will not leave." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he reached for Lyra, pulling her closer. The walls around them seemed to close in, the space growing smaller with each passing second. There was no telling what would happen next, but one thing was clear, they were no longer the ones in control. As the walls continued to hum, Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. They were trapped, but this wasn't the end. Not yet. He would find a way out. He always did,